The new Berlin airport was supposed to open in 2011. It ultimately opened in 2020 and cost several billion euros more than planned.
Yeah, and some people think this is a kind of a unique disaster, but actually it isn't. It's a systematic problem.
And today we're going to have a look at it, how these things happen and what can be realistically done to avoid it.
Welcome to Shift Happens, the podcast where we talk about energy, tech, leadership, and large scale projects, where sometimes, let's be honest, not everything goes according to plan. My name is Manuel.
And my name is Dirk. And together we both talk about topics that we regard as interesting, challenging in a wide world of energy developments.
If you've ever worked in big projects, you know the pattern. The project is big, but it's achievable. The numbers are tight, but you can manage it. It's very complex, there's a lot of risks, but everything seems achievable.
Yes, and then 2 or 3 years later, you have delays, budget overruns, external pressure, and things look pretty dim.
And actually, there's a lot of research in large or mega projects done by, for example, at Merrow or Bent Flyvbjerg, who have researched thousands of big projects. And they found it's not just bad luck, it's actually systematic.
Now, before we dive into the details of how these projects go wrong in the end, let's first talk about some terminology. So, what actually is a large project? Yeah? What defines a large project? We have, of course, high financial investment, several hundreds of millions of euros. We have complex stakeholder environments, governments, officials, public, lots of companies being involved. We have extended timelines. These projects tend to span over many, many years. And we have complex coordination. So you have multiple borders, interfaces where the project is interacting with something else.
Yeah, and when we talk about mega projects, it's actually the next level. So we are talking about several billions of investments, huge timelines. Usually these are the kind of infrastructure projects. So we're thinking about airports, railway stations, or big energy assets like offshore wind installations or offshore oil platforms. So these are projects which are very, very complex and often with public interest or public interfaces to politicians or the public in itself.
So we know all of that, of course, when we start such a project. So why do they still go wrong? Why do they fail?
That's a good question. I think it fundamentally boils down to five main elements. The first, to me, is optimism bias, or sometimes optimism pressure, which is the tendency to overestimate good things when you are looking into the future. So, if you're part of a project or a project manager of a project, you have the tendency to think that your project is different for some reason. It will go faster, it will go better, there will be less challenges. And this is a kind of a bias that you need to overcome to come up to realistic estimates for the future.
Yeah, and there's also that surrounding pressure and expectation of management and or maybe even governmental institutions. There's a certain amount that is likely to get approved, and so you basically work towards that target in order to get it approved, although more thorough examination would show you that you are too optimistic about these things. So you can be pressured into a success case in order to get forward with the project.
Yeah, and there's actually research evident from Bent Flyvbjerg, for example, that shows that transportation projects usually have cost overruns of around 30%. And this is partly due to this optimism or ambitious planning of these kind of projects.
The second element is weak early planning. So basically, how you start initiating your project and what you do in order to get it on track. This relates also then partly back to what we discussed for the first element. At Merrow from IPA, which is Independent Project Analysis, an agency that is making their living basically on analyzing all of these plannings of projects, he estimated that 65% of projects fail because of things that have been not done in these early planning stages. So most of the damage is done actually before the project even starts.
Yeah, he clearly emphasizes on front-end loading or early planning of projects, and he makes it clear that it's very important to be clear about the detailed scope definition, to do a proper risk assessment, to get clear stakeholder alignment for these projects, because the damage is already done at that phases.
Yes. One key example that is floating in literature is the FBI case index, a project that was done in the early 2000s. Huge IT projects, a lot of code to be done. It went up to a cost level of 170 million US dollars before it was then ultimately scrapped in 2005 because it simply did not get any usable result, although a huge effort has been taken. And then ultimately it went back to sort of inadequate requirements, yeah, understanding of requirements in the beginning and how these things have been sort of put on track. And then also oversight and leadership. If you often have then changes in the project management and the leadership of the project, you also do not have any consistency in bringing things forward. These modes often also get more prominent when you basically already start running into problems. Yeah, so that the oversight is basically said, this guy is not doing it. We need a new, more intelligent guy or better guy to do it. And that's how these things then get basically stuck. And then to ultimately stop something that already has cost so much money is also actually a major decision in the end.
Yeah, and this is not just for IT projects where sometimes, the scope is not always 100% clear. These are very dynamic projects. Sometimes we call it, agile projects. But this also happens in classical projects like infrastructure projects. Targets are changing, there's scope changing, dynamics are changing all over the place. So this is really difficult to manage these kind of projects. Now, this brings me to the third element, which is complexity. And this is not just technical complexity. These kind of projects have increased complexity, exponentially higher complexity than other projects in several dimensions. This is organizational setup, it's interfaces you need to manage, it's stakeholders you need to align, it's communication channels, risk management. Everything is very, very complex, up to dealing with political agendas and public opinions.
Yeah. And it only needs one element to go wrong sometimes. One tiny delay, one thing not delivered, one slip here, and suddenly five other things that are connected stop as well. So then you're facing a much more complex problem that started with only one tiny mistake, basically.
Yeah, and in these projects, it's really like the projects are big, but also the mistakes can have big impacts.
Yes. This leads us to the fourth element here, clear decision making and leadership. So specifically in complex mega projects without clear decision processes and the right leadership, you are very much on the way to fail, specifically when the first problems start arising.
Yes, and the Berlin Airport project is a good example in that regard. Initially planned at 2 billion euros, it ended up spending 7 billion euros. It was initially planned to start operations in 2011. It then actually went operational in 2020, which is a 9-year delay. Now, the most notorious problem discussed in this project was the wrong installation of the firefighting system and the smoke capturing system, but the real problem actually lies really deeper. So one of the main problems was that these projects was almost like a revolving door for technical directors and CEOs of the projects. So there was a heavy rotation in top leadership in this project. The next problem was that the supervisory board was mainly composed of politicians, which unfortunately had no real experience in large scale infrastructure projects. And this kind of setup led to a lot of bad management and leadership decisions for the projects. Just to name a few of them, the first site that was decided for the Berlin airport was actually the least favorable location, but it was taken because of political considerations. This also led to underestimation of customers that are going to the airport. So the capacity was wrongly planned, which then lead to a need to readjust the scope of the project completely. A second very prominent decision that was taken, which was not the best decision, is to forego with a single contractor for the construction. Instead of using one single contractor, it was actually decided to subcontract everything to 50 different contractors, which made the management and the complexity of the projects crazy. There was a lot of interfaces, a lot of communication that went wrong. And in the end, when something went wrong, there was no clear accountability in the project.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is then when, in the end, clear leadership would help a little bit, would sort of, in case it's not completely unmanageable, would help in bringing things back on track. But then usually you are already in a reactive and firefighting mode only. Yeah, and this is then basically a very difficult situation to recover from.
And finally, the last point, which is learning from previous projects. And we have to say it that usually organizations are not really good at learning from failures or past experiences. Projects end, people leave, and everything then remains in the past. People love to tell success stories, but they really hesitate to talk about mistakes and failures that happen. And now all these lessons learned from these projects, they end up in some kind of folder and nobody's really taking them in account. And this is not about blaming or finger pointing to projects or people. It's more about what did go wrong and what can we learn out of this.
Yeah, and it's actually quite. We've seen that it's a major effort really to install a process that captures these lessons learned, and it needs to be followed up, and it's a lot of energy to be put in, and because it's not really happening always, that's why the same mistakes are done over and over again.
So now, what really makes a difference in practice?
From the things that we've discussed before, 5 elements or 5 points stand out, I would say. So we talked about first front-end loading, the proper planning of the project, have a realistic schedule, realistic budget, and apply the right amount of risk management, not only identifying, but also managing the risk that you see. That then relates to a second point, apply the right governance to this project, the right way of decision making to prepare these decisions and the processes that lead to these decision points. And this is then third, sort of the task of the right leadership in the project. Select people who have done complexity before, who understand complexity, maybe also have had a different perspective in the past from just looking at these things, that fully appreciate the task that they are about to do. Then, if you are so complex, as a fourth point, be able to decompose such a big complex entity into maybe smaller, more manageable projects. And then as a fifth point, and this may be also quite important, is allow outside view, look for benchmarks, get a second, a third opinion on your plans on how you're conducting these things, have that benchmarking at certain points in order to get feedback, right experience in order to correct before you start on the wrong track.
Yes, and large and mega projects really need to put a lot of emphasis into the planning phases because you want to make sure that you have planned the project as best as possible before you move into execution. And I would always almost say that if planning feels slow in this project, you're almost on the right track. If planning feels rushed, you have the tendency that it's going to be expensive in the later run.
Yes.
Now, not all large or mega projects go wrong. There are actually quite some projects that are managed very well.
Yeah. One example is Johan Sverdrup in Norway. This is a major offshore development that was originally planned out for 19 billion US dollars cost. It came in actual at 13 billion US dollars, significantly less. Production started earlier than initially scheduled, and it was an overall big success actually for the Norwegian economy. It was also planned out to reduce emissions by 80 to 90% by being sort of connected to onshore power supply. Um, Very typical also nowadays in Norwegian projects. So overall, a great success. And that is not magic. You know, if you look at the project, it was properly planned and it was staffed according to its complexity. It was conducted thoroughly. And yeah, it was an overall very consistent approach to the whole project. Yeah. Things were run according to how it should have been done. Yeah. And also great success for the operating company, basically, then in the end. And maybe an additional factor that contributed to the success was that the project was split up in up to 3 phases. So they didn't try to do the whole shebang in one go. They basically had an intelligent approach in phase one, phase two, phase three, successively adding complexity to the project, adding more wells to be hooked into the production. and that basically ensured that they can have manageable packages to work on.
Yeah, and there's a lot of lessons learned also from good cases. So also the success stories give you a lot of lessons learned on how to do things better. But I think that's a really good point to wrap things up. Large and mega projects will always be challenging, just by their nature. But there are a lot of things you can learn from previous examples. And usually, this is not things that just happen by coincidence or some kind of mysterious things that happen. It's usually a pattern or a systematic failure that is happening in these projects.
And if you are somehow involved in mega projects, you probably have recognized several of these topics that we've discussed today.
And we also would be interested in if you have worked in projects, what was your biggest challenge or even failure in these kind of projects?
Yeah. In that sense, now, thank you very much for your kind attention and looking forward to the next podcast that we are producing.
Thanks a lot. With that, we thank you for dialing in today's episode.
I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Maybe it gave you something to think about. Maybe you agree, you disagree. Let us know.
If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues or tag us on social media.
You can find us on MND Consult, that is mnd-consult.com.
And if you have a topic you would like us to unpack or a story you would like to share, feel free to reach out.
So take care and remember,
Shift happens.